When you think about church, do you think about people being accused of getting drunk before 9 a.m. or about people teleporting or pastors giving a sermon people don't like so much they get stoned for it or angels rescuing people from prison? The early church wasn't concerned with carpet colors and whether or not to use a pipe organ. It was a hotbed of scandal and adventure. Is there anything from what we learn in the book of Acts and the history and culture around it that should matter to us today? We're going to be talking about all of that in today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. We're so excited that you guys are listening. Theology on Air was born out of an event here in Houston for young adults called Theology on Tap. We get together over craft beer and we talk about philosophy and apologetics and faith and culture and, of course, theology. It's in the name. And it's a lot of fun. So you should come join us. If you live in the Houston area, check us out at houstontot.com for all the details about that. But if you live either in Houston or outside, you can always listen to the podcast and show us some love by following us and rating us, reviewing us, telling all your friends, put it on social media, scream it from the mountaintops, all the things. But I'm Sarah Stone. I'm the outreach director for young adults at Memorial Drive Presbyterian on the west side of Houston, joined as always, by Evan McClanahan. He does it all. He's the senior pastor and the janitor and everything in between at First Lutheran in Midtown. And joined today by one of our regular guests at this point, Ted Wright. Ted is the founder and executive of Epic Archaeology, which explores the intersection between archaeology and biblical history, as well as Christian apologetics. Ted is the former teaching director at crossexamine.org. That's the whole Frank Turek thing, if you're familiar, and has taught Old Testament and biblical archaeology at Southern Evangelical Seminary and Bible College, as well as Charlotte Christian College and Seminary for about 10 years. And he's always coming on and giving us nuggets about how culture and archaeology fit into the biblical narrative. And so welcome back.
Great to be with you guys again.
Yeah. So we are trying to, about once a month, put out an episode on the actual Bible. Seems like a good idea since we're Theology on Air. That's where we get our theology from. And so the last one we recorded, if you're listening in order, is the last biblical one was about the four Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We had Paul Copan on talking at a sort of a high 30,000 foot view overarching about the Gospels. And we ended there, and we're picking up today in the book of Acts, which is actually the second part of kind of a two-book compilation by Luke. And Luke he's not a Jew, but he's putting together everything that he's investigated about what happened with Jesus and then what happened with the early church. And so, Ted, why don't you just start off by giving us kind of the scope of the book of Acts? Who is this guy Luke? Why is he telling us stuff? Give us like the big overarching ideas, and then we'll get into some of the weeds.
Yeah, Sarah. So Luke is an interesting guy in and of himself, but you sort of alluded to it. He wasn't Jewish, and the evidence seems to point to the fact that he was very likely a Greek living in Asia Minor in the first century, and obviously became a Christ follower. And we have two books written by Luke in the New Testament, of course, the Gospel of Luke, and then, of course, the book of Acts. And what's interesting about Luke, I find there's so much to say about him, is that he is considered to be a physician, but not in a physician like we would think. You hear the term Dr. Luke, but that's actually in a passage in, I think it's in Colossians. Paul makes allusion to saying hello to the physician Luke. But he is very likely the author of course, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And so you have kind of a 2-volume set. Whenever I teach either book, I always tell my students that they go together. So you can't take one without the other. So they sort of think of like, Lord of the Rings is like 3 volumes, and you can read one book and sort of get it, but it really, you have to read all 3 to get the whole story. Yeah. And that's sort of how we look at the Luke Acts as sort of a 2-volume set. And just a couple of quick things here about Luke and authorship, and actually from the scholarly accounts, there are indications in the Gospel of Luke as well as the book of Acts, especially the book of Acts, and toward the middle of the book itself, that they are the writer of the book itself was actually present with the Apostle Paul on his missionary journey. So scholars call these the we passages, where he's actually with him. And so for instance, in I think it's beginning in chapter 16, he talks about we and us and things like that. So indicating that Luke was very likely present with the Apostle Paul. So he wrote these two books to present a case to a certain man by the name of Theophilus. And I don't know if we want to get into that yet, but I can.
Well, maybe just a nugget, because I don't want to dwell on it too much, but some people think it was a real person, a patron of sorts. Some people think it sort of is like an archetype for all the people that want to know. What do you think?
Well, I was going to tell you, so the book itself, chapter 1 starts out, he says in Acts chapter 1, verses 1-5, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. After his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs, or some translations say many infallible proofs that he was alive. And so that former book that Luke is talking about, of course, is the Gospel of Luke itself, which starts out this way, very similar to the way that the book of Acts starts out. He says that many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us, who were from the first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And with this in mind, he says in these first few verses, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that, he says at the end of verse 4, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. So several years ago, I was actually in the Dallas area with when I was working with Frank Turek, and we were there in Plano, actually, in the headquarters of Josh McDowell, and we were there with many other scholars and apologists, and I think Nabil Qureshi was there, and Mary Jo Sharp, and we were looking at some manuscripts that were being taken out of these mummy masks called cartonnage, and it's another backstory. But anyway, when I was there, Josh was telling me about I don't know how we got on the subject, but we were talking about the book of Acts and about archaeology, and Josh says, I have a book I want to send you, Ted. Give me your address. Here's my card. Here's my guy. So he sent me this book, and this whole guy's book was a doctoral dissertation trying to identify the Theophilus, and his theory is that Luke and Acts are actually sort of a legal account that Theophilus may have been a Roman or some type of government authority who was a believer, and this was sort of a legal sort of case that that Paul, because of course, as we're going to see in the book of Acts, Paul is actually headed to Rome, accused of sedition, and obviously it's written with sort of a defense, an orderly account. So that word investigated, to go back to that word where Luke uses investigated, interestingly, that's the Greek word historia, which is what, when people think about history, they think about, something that's just made up. But the original Herodotus actually used that term as well. The word history itself comes from the Greek word historia, which means literally investigation. So it's really fascinating that Luke very well could have been creating this to Theophilus to defend Paul against sedition of the Roman state. It's basically saying, here, we're going to lay it out. Here's what this Jesus movement's all about. And not only that, but then also to show you the certainty of the things you believe. But but you're right, Sarah. You mentioned this a second ago. There's really no way for sure that we can know this with 100% certainty. It's sort of just theories that go around. But certainly there seems to be someone that Luke had in mind that he was writing to, and really, I think the most important part of this that we can take away is that this is an orderly account, and it's orderly, and it's written sort of an apologetic, slant in mind.
Right, so that you'll know these things are true.
Absolutely.
Right, like that they happened, whether it's to get Paul out of jail, as it were, or not.
Yes.
It didn't end well for Paul, but but grand scheme, it worked out great for him. So
yes.
Do you have a theory on the date?
Yes, I actually do. In fact, I have a slide. I'm looking at some slides because I gave a presentation on this here in Wheaton area about 3-4 months ago. And let me find the slide. They're actually, just to give you, there's a whole lot to it, but this is actually taken from a Roman historian by the name of Colin Hemer, who wrote a book called The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History. And that book is amazing. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But basically, what Hemer says is that there are really great indications within the book itself, internally in the text, that indicate the book was written pre-70 AD. Here's why. And just to give you a few of these, there are actually, I think, I'm going to list about 6. Just throw some verses out to you. People can jot these down. These are in the book of Acts, but you can check them out yourself. And I think there's like 15 or 17 or maybe even more that Hemer lists. But Acts chapter 4, verse 1, he says the prominence of the Sadducees accords with the pre-70 setting, for the Jewish revolt destroyed their political ascendancy. So when the Romans came in, they literally abolished the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Mm-hmm. So when Luke is writing within the book of Acts about the prominence of the Pharisees and Sadducees, they could not have been prominent if it was after 70 AD. Mm-hmm. So he's writing the present tense as if they were still alive. So this is just one. Acts chapter 6, verse 1, the Hellenists propose a notoriously difficult problem, Hemer says. It seems likely that as a group, however defined, it belongs distinctively to the earliest period in the church. That's in Acts 6:1. Acts chapter 6, verse 9, the synagogue of the Libertines. Seems most likely that only one synagogue is meant, and this could be possibly identified with an inscription that was found in Jerusalem called the Theodotus inscription that was certainly dates to 70 AD, which could indicate that's the synagogue of the Libertines, which was actually discovered, or at least evidence for that was discovered. Acts chapter 7, again, the prominence of the Sadducees accords with that. And then also Acts chapter 8, verse 1, which is in fact, chapter 7 and chapter 8, which is the first martyr in the church, Stephen, the reaction, the visceral reaction of the Pharisees and the Sadducees against Stephen seems to fit his radical attack on the temple and its priestly services. So because before 70 AD, the temple was still standing, and it was the center of Jewish life. So this would explain why the Pharisees and the Sadducees were so up in arms about Stephen, that he was literally attacking how people would approach God, according to their understanding of it anyway. And then one more, and then there are many of these. Acts chapter 8, verse 9, which is, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but it's an incident that may be linked to a date given by Justin Martyr, who is a native of Nablus in Samaria. And he is dated, this reference here is dated firmly to the reign of Claudius. So this is pre-70 AD. So again, Colin Hemer lists many others. Acts 10:1, the name of Cornelius reflects a Roman practice which persisted into the Julio-Claudian dynasty among older and more contemporary or conservatively minded, Roman army soldiers, that they would name, like an old soldier, they would name him Cornelius. That's sort of like
let me interrupt you a little bit, because
yes.
I know some people might be listening and thinking, why the heck does it matter when it's dated, right? And of course, one of the biggest things that we know about Acts is that it never mentions the destruction of the temple, which would have been, I think J. Warner Wallace likens it to like writing an account of New York City in like the 2000s and not mentioning the two towers coming down. Like, you just don't do that. Right. Even more so, we had Adam Wynn on talking, I think he was the last Bible episode that we did in 2021, talking about the intertestamental period. And I'm getting ready to teach this in my Bible study, so it's fresh in my mind. But the Hellenization that had happened and all of the battles with the Seleucids and the Ptolemaics and all of this stuff had rendered all these faction groups, including the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Essenes and whatever. And so you get why A, the temple is hugely important, and B, why the Pharisees and the Sadducees are so freaking cranky. And it actually sheds a lot of light on what happens in Acts, because we think of Paul being just such a terrible guy before Jesus got him, right? Like, he was such a sinner, so lost, but he's doing something really similar to what happened in the Maccabean revolt, where he's like, hey, you're not doing these things that Jews are supposed to be doing. And so we're going to take care of that violently. I encourage people to go back and listen to that episode as well. I also just realized I'm screaming into the mic. Sorry.
Oh, no. And conventional language on the dating would put like Luke and Matthew like 85 or so, like 80 to 85. That's what I was always taught. That's when they were dated. So 15 years after the destruction of the temple. And then John is in the 90s. Maybe Mark is in the 60s. But most conservatives, well, at least a lot of conservative scholars I listen to now, put all of them before the destruction of the temple. That's and right. that just puts it easy, closer to the events, closer to eyewitnesses. The average kind of college kid reading Bart Ehrman gets the impression that, we're like 4 generations removed from eyewitnesses, and it's, it's like the telephone game and all this kind of stuff. But someone like Luke, again, if you read like the beginning of Luke and then of Acts, he as you've already said, it's an investigation.
Right.
For reasons. By the way, Theophilus means lover of God, right? So
that's correct. Yes.
So I don't know if that means that was his real name, or that points to the fact that might have been some kind of alias, but
Interesting.
Yeah.
But either way, there's a trustworthiness.
Yeah.
Like these were real eyewitnesses to the real things that happened, and you don't have to trust it, but if you're gonna, poo-poo it because it was written so much later, then good luck.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So, okay. Did you want to say anything else maybe about Luke and who he was before we kind of dive into the main? Yeah,
I do. And I have a really interesting quote here. So let me just mention real quick about his, the whole idea about him being a physician. Now, when we talk about physician, one of the earliest records of a physician that we have in the ancient world is Galen, Galen. And he is a little bit later than the Apostle Luke. And Galen actually learned physiology and how to sort of stitch up people from the gladiatorial games. I mean, yeah. So what's interesting though is that it was sort of like a home remedy type. They didn't have an understanding of physiology or anything like that, but they were considered themselves physicians. And he was a Greek, and the Greeks have a long tradition of being very observant of human anatomy and that kind of thing. But there's an interesting pastoral element to this quote I found from a Greek scholar by the name of Kenneth Wiest, who I think really is a brilliant scholar, but then also he has a really great insight into just the grace of God and how God puts people together that are just, they go together wonderfully. And Luke and Paul would have been such great traveling companions. But this is the quote from Wiest. He says, "Here is a Greek doctor of medicine leaving his medical practice to be his personal physician, the personal physician of an itinerant preacher, to share his hardship and privations, his dangers and toil. The great success of the apostle, whom he attended in a medical way, is due in some measure to the physician's watchful care over his patient. Luke knew all the marks of the Lord Jesus Christ on the body of the apostle Paul, the scars left after the assaults on his person. He had bathed and attended these wounds, and now his patient, grown old before his time, was suffering the discomforts of the Roman cell. He had to be guarded against disease. Only Luke is with me," Paul says. What a comfort he must have been to Paul. That's a great quote. It's just a wonderful to think about that of course we sort of just kind of passed by the fact that he was with Paul, but imagine what Luke saw. Imagine the things he must have seen with his own eyes, and as he writes about these in the book of Acts, and how this must have had a huge impression on him. But I think it's so cool that Paul was beaten and put in prison, shipwrecked not once but 3 times, and only Luke is with me. And there's a really great movie, by the way. Speaking of that, if you have seen, I think it's called Paul, and it's starring Jim Caviezel, who actually plays Luke. I don't know if you guys have seen that.
Didn't he also play Jesus? He's really like milking this whole biblical characters for all it's worth.
He is.
Well,
the guy
Hollywood
that
won't hire him anymore, so
Oh man,
that's right. He's going to cover all the people. But anyway, yeah, that's the last thing I want to say about Luke being the physician. But I think it's pretty remarkable. But Sarah, you were mentioning earlier sort of a bird's eye view. And as we said a minute ago, Luke, of course, Acts is the second part of Luke. And what's interesting about this, that the book of Acts itself is that it is both very grounded in history, grounded in historical reality, but yet there is a strong supernatural element to it. It's sort of this paradoxical book that it is, you can go and investigate it, and there have been, literally hundreds and hundreds of artifacts and historical references and things like that actually you can go to. You can see this, you can go to this road, you can go to this city, you can go and see some of the ships that Paul may have sailed on, or at least ones like it, in museums. So all of it's grounded in history, but there's a strong element of the supernatural. And there's a book I found years ago. Actually, I was teaching New Testament archaeology, and I wanted a book on the New Testament, the archaeology of the Apostle Paul specifically. And I found a book by a professor at Yale University named Wayne Meeks, and it's called The Social World of the Apostle Paul. And to illustrate the point I'm trying to say is that Meeks the book is brilliant, by the way. He lays out, and the question that he explores, and the question that many people sort of wonder about, is when you look at the Christian, the secular scholars will say it's a sect, and it was a sect of Judaism. It was a sub-branch of Judaism, because it came up out of Judaism. But you wonder, how in the world could Christianity, how could Jesus' followers have been so small and start out so in a humble way, and yet eventually take over the Roman world? I mean, that's just remarkable. So it's either just a great accident of history, or there's something supernatural about it. Now, Meeks in his book describes some of the historical and some of the, I guess, earthly reasons why the success of the early church. And he mentions the Roman roads, which by the time the Apostle Paul was alive, there were literally thousands of miles of paved Roman roads. The Roman trade paths through the ocean, going from Alexandria, Egypt, all the way across the Mediterranean, through Levant, and all the way up through Greece and Asia Minor. So there were these extensive trade routes that Paul could have traveled. It was sort of like the ancient internet, if you will, in Roman cities. And he focuses a lot on Roman cities and Roman social culture and things like that. So basically, Meeks essentially says the reason why Christianity was so successful was because Paul was such a go-getter, number one, and number two, because of the influx of all these new technologies like roads and things like that really allowed Christianity to spread. And I would agree with that, but I will also say, in fact, it's in actually, see here, where is it? It's in Acts chapter 1, the very beginning of Acts, where he says in Acts chapter 1, verse 4, of course, this is at the very beginning of the book, and this is going to explain, this is going to be sort of the arrow that you're going to see the rest of the book. And that is that the disciples, this is right after the resurrection. Christ is about to be ascended into heaven, and they ask him, they said, Lord, are you now going to restore the kingdom? That's that's a whole other subject in of itself. Because they understood as Jews that Christ was the son of David and that he was going to establish the kingdom on earth. That's what they thought. And he says, it's not for you to know the times, the seasons, but and he goes on to say, you will be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the world. So it starts out where you are, and it spreads all throughout the Roman world. So he didn't correct their theology. He just said, no, there's going to be now the spread of this growing message throughout the Roman world. And that's exactly what you see. Sort of a pond, a stone in a pond, and the ripple effects then become just worldwide.
Stones are amazing like that.
Yeah.
My last name is Stone. I have to go to those jokes anytime I can. We're actually going to be having Jay Warner Wallace on to talk about his newest book in a couple months. And he talks a little bit about this, that like, why did Jesus come at this time? Could he have come later? Sure. Could he have come earlier? Perhaps not. I mean, he could have come whenever he wanted, but if the time was right, because of this idea of the openness of things, the roads, the postal system, all these kinds of things. But you mentioned something I think is interesting about Luke having this supernatural language, and he's a scientist and he's walking alongside Paul. It almost makes me think of like Fox and Mulder, remember from the X-Files? You have like the supernatural person and then the like scientific skeptic, but they work together and it makes it more believable. But I heard recently that Luke in his gospel account uses terms around spirit and spiritual more than any of the other ones. He'll just say it like in passing, like, and the power of the spirit, Jesus walked to Nazareth, or the power of the spirit, blah, blah, blah. And then of course he talks a lot about the spirit in Acts. And I think that's fascinating that he's a scientist and he's like, but y'all, something spiritual is happening. It makes it more credible to me.
Yes.
But okay, we got to get past all the nerdy stuff and get to what happened in Acts. Maybe you can give us just like a bullet pointed, the highlights of the movie if we haven't gotten to see it or read it recently.
Right. That's right. One of the key things is really the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, when Christ, of course, said, he even told them before in the Gospels, he said, and I'm going to go away and I'm going to send the Comforter to you. And of course, we see this with the disciples, and the Holy Spirit comes, and it's sort of like the Greek word that's used for the coming of the Holy Spirit. It's like, it's just that they have this power. You're going to receive power when the Holy Spirit's come upon you. And the word is dunamos, which is like dynamite. You've heard that. It's kind of a funny, preachers use this all the time, but it's really true, because the power doesn't originate from them. The power is through the Holy Spirit, and it's through this Holy Spirit power that you cannot explain. These men that were just commoners, they were fishermen, they were tax collectors, and yet they're eloquent, and they're saying things that they're surprised they're saying, and they're healing people that are lame and deaf and blind and things like that. So you have the central element of the book of Acts is the Acts of the Apostles are really point back to the power of the Holy Spirit, the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit in the church. And that's a debate that I know Christians have as to whether or not that those signs that were given to the apostles are still for today. I don't know if you guys have ever done a show on cessationism. We
have a great debate on that. People can go back to Stephen Croteau and Dan Akins talking about it. It's one of our best, I think.
Very good.
Yeah, so we don't have to get into the weeds on that today.
Right. I didn't think so. But essentially, it's the sending of the Holy Spirit that in Acts chapter 2, where you see this happen, and so this power, the power of God, you can see it first in Peter, and as he preaches this amazing sermon, and then you see this sort of, as Jesus said in Acts chapter 1, verse 5, or verses 6, 5 through 7 and 8, that the power is going to spread beginning where they are. And that's an interesting thing too, is that the Christian message didn't start out in Rome. It started out in Jerusalem. Well, why is that significant? It's significant because that's where the crucifixion happened. That's where Jesus was crucified. And so why would you preach a message if you're going to make it up in Jerusalem? And that's where it starts. And so we see that's where the trouble begins for the apostles, and they're thrown in prison and they're threatened. And then we see, of course, Stephen, one of the first martyrs, who is, again, filled with the Holy Spirit. And he, beginning with the Old Testament, beginning with Moses and the prophets, he begins to lay out what God has done through Jesus Christ, and Jesus of Nazareth, how he was the promised son of Abraham, the son of David, and how they were the ones that he came for, and yet they crucified him. And so there's this interaction between another major theme that you see throughout the book of Acts is the interaction between the Jews and the Gentiles, and how Paul goes to the synagogues first, and then he's rejected, and then he goes to the Gentiles. And it's in the book of Acts that we see him really focus his missionary efforts in trying to reach the Gentiles. And he never stops trying to reach his Jewish brothers. But we see this all throughout the book. And he goes on missionary journey, throughout the Roman world, and all of the cities that are mentioned in the book of Acts have been discovered historically and archaeologically. In fact, you can actually go on tours. Many Christian tour services, you can actually go on the Apostle Paul Footsteps tour, or a sail, or a cruise, or whatever. Actually last year I had on.
Then you get shipwrecked, and they put you in jail.
Yeah.
There's snakes. It's a real adventure.
That's right. Yeah. But I had on Mark Wilson, who is a scholar that lives in Turkey. He's an American scholar, lives in Turkey, and he lives in one of the cities that the Apostle Paul visited. And he actually leads tours for Christian groups, and he's written books on this. And so that's the other thing about the book itself. Again, to go back to the human element of the book, is that it's sort of like a tour guide. It's sort of like a tour book of the ancient Roman world. And before archaeology, some of the only one of the only places that many of these cities were mentioned was in the book of Acts. And so as archaeology began to come on the scene, we uncover different things about these cities, and that they existed, and that even certain individuals such as Gallio, there was the Gallio inscription, and the Sergius Paulus inscription that was actually discovered in Greece, that mentions one of the Roman officials that was actually converted by the Apostle Paul. So this is pretty remarkable stuff. To go back to
well, wait, before you keep going, I want to, so if we're talking about some of the major events that happened, some people might, when I was little, I was confused by this. So in the Gospels, Jesus calls 12 disciples to him and says, follow me. And they come along, they see all the cool stuff happen. Judas, things don't go well for him. He dies. But then you come into Acts, and then you have some extra people like, where the heck does Stephen come from? Who's Stephen? Or various other names. So my question is, one, who are these people and how are they connected? Are any of the original disciples there? And then 2, what is the difference between a disciple and an apostle? And I don't mean to get into like modern day apostles. We'll do a whole other podcast on that. But just biblically, when people are like, is a disciple the same as, was Barnabas around the whole time? Like, who are these people? You know?
And there are no modern day apostles. So.
Okay, boom, there. We didn't even have to do a podcast episode on it. Just there are none.
Yeah. So the way I understand apostle is an apostle in the New Testament sense of the term had to have actually seen Jesus with his own eyes after the resurrection. He had to have seen Jesus before, and then before the crucifixion, and then after the resurrection. And a disciple.
Wait, an apostle did? Because Paul didn't see Jesus. Well, I mean, he saw him, but not like, saw him.
Right.
Well, there's a standard when they're choosing the Matthias to replace Judas. It's
correct.
like, well, it's someone who has been with us in essence.
Okay.
Right? So, but Paul, I don't think Paul had to go through that process because Jesus
he had a special, special,
That's right.
But it does make you wonder what Paul did see of Jesus' ministry that we don't know about, right? Like maybe he saw some things from afar or would have heard some things. Might have been some of the crowds mentioned, But anyway.
No, absolutely. That's right. But no, the apostles, I mean, obviously Jesus chose the 12. Those were his 12 that he chose. But we also know from the New Testament that there were many crowds that always followed Christ. And at one point he said, where is everybody? Or they said, are you still with me? And he goes, well, Lord, you have the words of life. Yeah. So they would come and go, ebb and flow. People would come and go into the ministry or follow the ministry of Christ. But of course, these were all fair weather disciples. He chose them, and they stayed with him most of the time. Of course, when he was arrested, many of them fled. But as far as a disciple goes, these are people who would have been just followers. I mean, that's just, if you want to be my disciple, you must take up your cross daily and follow me. So the disciples were, there were people who were disciples of Christ, but not necessarily apostles. But I think when you think of apostle, I think of someone having authority and having been recognized by Jesus' closest apostles, by the ones that he chose as being, having authority. And of course, they chose Matthias as to replace Judas. So there are only 12 apostles, and then Judas, of course, committed suicide, and they chose Matthias, and then you've got
disciples. There were only 12 disciples.
12 disciples, yeah.
Okay, and then coming in, they replaced Judas, and they're going strong. Is Stephen one of those? And I just missed it the whole time in the Gospels? Where does Stephen come from?
It doesn't say. The text just doesn't say. That's,
and Philip too, right? Philip was not one of the 12 either, but he just kind of shows up, I think.
Yeah. So the way I understand it is Stephen was, obviously there were Jews who followed Christ. who were believers.
Yeah.
Such as Joseph of Arimathea. Why wasn't he a disciple or an apostle?
Yeah.
But he was a follower of Christ. So I don't know. There were many people who did trust and believe. And
well, you not knowing makes me feel better about not knowing. So that's a win as far as
and I'm wrong about Philip. Philip was a disciple.
When you said
that's what I thought. I was like,
I was trying to go through my Rolodex real fast, but anyway. But okay, so continue. So the beginning part of Acts before Paul comes on the scene, we've got people like Stephen, Peter. Poor Peter, he was like all in, and then he denied Christ, and then he was sort of like back in the crew and the squad. And then he just stays strong until his gruesome death. But he's a big part of Acts until Paul comes on the scene, right?
He is. Yes, absolutely.
And you have people that have stuck around for the 40 days and after Passover and after Jesus' death, they've stuck around and they're kind of camped out around this like early church movement. And then we get like the whole, the story of everybody kind of giving to the collective, which is not about communism. It's just about a certain time and place where people were excited about this new thing that was happening. And you get the story of like Ananias and Sapphira. They lied to the Holy Spirit. Didn't go well for them. Walk us through some other kind of main bullet point things that happen in Acts. So really the main, after you get to the coming of the Holy Spirit, and then you've got some of these initial happenings in Jerusalem, the first rumblings of course, Peter giving the sermon, and then Stephen being martyred, and then young Saul of Tarsus seeing this. You have the conversion of Paul or Saul. Interestingly, he is from
Tarsus, which I learned this just fairly recently, that Tarsus, of course, I knew it was in Asia Minor, but what I didn't know about it was that it's right off the coast there. It's a famous port in Asia Minor, just north. So if you look at Israel on a map, and you go north, you have Lebanon and then Syria, and you keep going a little bit north, and it starts to jet up into Asia Minor or Western Turkey. And so Tarsus is right there, right above that. But it was a seaport, and it's where Cleopatra and Mark Antony met. Right there. Yeah. Interesting.
She was a Ptolemaic.
She was a Ptolemy. Her great grandfather was Ptolemaeus, who was one of the generals of Alexander the Great. But in any case, so Saul is converted, and then he, of course, goes to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples to confirm that he understands the gospel correct. Now, what's interesting, he does go to Arabia, according to the book of Galatians. He goes to Arabia for about 3 years, which I think is interesting. That's a whole nother subject. There's a lot of debate about what exactly he was doing in Arabia. There's a theory that Mount Sinai is in Arabia among Old Testament scholars. Some scholars completely and utterly reject that. Others people say that no, Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula. But if Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia or in Arabia of Paul's day, it would make sense because Paul was a Pharisee. He was trained under the Rabbi Gamaliel in Jerusalem, so it makes sense. He was trying to reconcile the Old Testament, the Torah, and the prophets with Messiah to try to understand how it all fits together. So to me, it makes sense why he would go to Arabia if Mount Sinai is in Saudi Arabia, or he could have just went there to go meditate and pray and wonder, how to fit all this together with the theology. So that's a huge thing. In fact, when he goes to Jerusalem, the disciples are like, this is the same Paul, that you're the same one that wanted to throw us into prison? Like, I don't know. Do you want to? So, he's convinced that to let Paul in, and then Paul confirms that indeed is this the gospel. Now, at the time, there were Judaizers, those early Christians who wanted Gentile Christians to actually have to follow the law, have to be circumcised. And so there was sort of a little debate that rose up between Peter and Paul on some of the specifics of the law. And as Paul understood, the understanding of the gospel is that no Gentile has to keep the law. In fact, the law that's never was the purpose of the law anyway. And so that kind of raises up, and you see that sort of interplay between some of the early disciples, or some of early Christ's first disciples in the Apostle Paul. And of course, Paul writes the entire book of Romans to lay out justification and how a person is justified. It's by faith alone. It's not by anything, nothing but no flesh shall be justified by the works of the law. So that's a huge thing. But the conversion of Paul is interesting. And what I find also fascinating about Paul, in addition to his conversion, is that today many scholars and many even secular people are fascinated by the Apostle Paul. And Evan and Sarah, I'm not sure. I know you probably have heard of this guy. Have you heard of Tom Holland? He wrote a book called Dominion, and it's about the Christian movement, and he has a lot of the Apostle Paul, but I got a quote here from him, which I think is really kind of cool, that it's remarkable if it's true, and I think there's no reason why it's not true, because I think he's very, very a great researcher. He says, never before had a single power controlled all the shipping lanes of the Mediterranean. Never before had there been such a network of roads on its shores. Paul, born in the port city of Tarsus on the coast of south of Galatia, had always known the horizons were there to be crossed. Now, shaking off the dust of Galatia from his sandals, he headed westwards toward the gleaming cities that circled the Aegean, Ephesus, Thessalonica, and Philippi. By the end of Paul's life, it has been estimated that he traveled some 10,000 miles.
Jeez, that's crazy.
10,000 miles. So that's a lot of miles to cover. And while he did this, now this is and I found this when I did a 2 Sunday study at a church here in the Chicago area on the book of Acts, and I found myself just completely running out of time because there's just so much to it. So what I thought we'd do is just sort of just look at Paul's travels, and there are literally dozens and dozens of cities that Paul went to, and just to list a few of these. Before
you go into that, so Paul has his moment with the Lord, right? And he's on the road, and then he's blinded, and then it sort of meets Jesus, and then goes somewhere and the scales fall off his eyes, and there's this whole thing that happens. But I don't think people realize, because we learn these stories back to back to back, then he goes away for like several years to be schooled by some women. Curious if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, I think Luke definitely is the guy who's going to be bringing up the role of women in the early church. I mean, he does in his book. I mean, his gospel. This is all his book. But Priscilla and Aquila, I don't know if you have any words about them, but then Paul is like schooled for several years. Things are still happening while he's away. Like Peter is kind of running the ship, would you say? And
yes.
then,
yes.
Okay. So any thoughts on, the women that taught him, if that has any bearing on how we understand?
The only thing I have about that is that that's what happened. I mean, and it shows us that with the good news. Several years ago, I wrote an article for Cross-Examined on women as apologists. This was, it had to have been 10 years ago or so when this happened. And so this is before Alyssa Childers was writing, before any of there's a big movement now in women apologists. And so there was a question, should women be apologists? And my article, and this to answer your question, Sarah, my article said, should women be? They already are. They were the first apologists. The first people that were at the empty tomb were women, and they were the first ones the first evangelists. And so we see that God uses women like Priscilla and Aquila, and even in leadership positions in the church. And it's remarkable because it's exactly what happened. That's and God, I mean, in order for the good news to be spread, of course, God uses everybody and anyone, and women were a key part of that. And keep in mind now, during the time of the Roman Empire, they didn't have the rights that women's rights that we do today in our Western societies. It was sort of male-dominated, sort of patriarchal type, even in Rome, even though there were some very strong women personalities. But all throughout the ancient world, women were not, they didn't really have positions of authority. But in the early church, you see them having these positions of authority and really important roles in the church. And I think that's true today as well.
Okay, we don't have to go any more into it. I just kind of wanted to put that in there. And so, okay, walk us through some of his journeys and some big things that happen. He's in and out of prison.
He's in and out of prison. The first place he goes to, Sarah, is he goes to it's one of my favorite sites in Israel because it is the major seaport in Israel. It's Caesarea Maritima, it's literally
Herod made that.
What's that?
Right? Herod the Great. He's the one that built that out, right?
He did. It was already a port. It was called Stratos Tower. And it was at when Octavius Augustus won the Battle of Actium in 31 BC over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, that Herod went to Octavian and basically said, I'll serve you. Before I was an ally of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, but now I'm going to serve you as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. And according to Josephus, he was so pleased with Herod that he gave Herod Stratos Tower, and Herod renamed it Caesarea Maritima and says, I'm going to make this the greatest city in Israel, or it was Israel at the time, it was Judea, and I'm going to name it in honor of you. And so it was the Greco-Roman, the center of the Greco-Roman world in Judea in the first century. And as it turns out, it was where the Praetorium was located. This is where the Apostle Paul actually stood before Agrippa, I think it was Agrippa, when he was pleading his case to go to Rome. And I've been to the site, and I've actually snorkeled there on the Mediterranean. You can actually, where the bay is, it's a beautiful place. And you can actually stand, Sarah and Evan, you can stand on the exact same spot or very close to it that the Apostle Paul very likely stood when he stood before and pled his case to go to Rome. You say, how do you know that? Well, it's because when they excavated the site, they found the Praetorium, the main government building in the first century, and they found the raised platform at the very end of it. It was a basilica. When you think of a basilica, don't think of a round, think of a square rectangular building. And the very end of that building is a raised platform, interestingly called the Bema. It's where the throne of the Roman government or king sat, and the judgments would be given there. So
Mm-hmm.
that platform is still in existence today in Caesarea, and you can go and stand right before it. So it's very likely that that's where Paul pled his case. And right beside it, just to the north, literally within eye shot, you can actually see a huge 10,000 seat hippodrome stadium that's there on the coast, and on the one side of it has been eroded away from the weather. So this is where one of the first Christians was converted, in Caesarea, and this is where Paul very likely sailed. Well, we know he sailed from Caesarea all the way to Rome, and that's where he launched out of his missionary journey. So that's been discovered. Antioch, of course, there are two Antiochs in the book of Acts: Pisidian Antioch and the Antioch in Syria, Antipatris, Apollonia, the Apiforum, Arabia, Assos, Assos, Athens, Berea, Caesarea, Chios, Kos, Corinth.
Are you going in alphabetical order?
Yeah, alphabetical order.
I was going to say, there's no way this just happened.
No. I put these in alphabetical order.
Yeah.
Derbe, of course, Ephesus, Crete, Hierapolis, Iconium, Jerusalem, Laodicea, Lycia, Lystra, Malta, Miletus, Myra, Neapolis, Nicopolis, Patara, Philippi, Ptolemais. I'm just jumping around here. One of the ones that I discovered, goodness, it's been many years ago now, was in Italy, was a city called Pozzuoli. And I didn't even know the city existed in the New Testament. This is where Paul, when he finally, after he being shipwrecked on Malta, he eventually boards another ship and he lands in Pozzuoli. And I am told by my Italian friends, no, Ted, it's called Pozzuoli. That's how the Italians say it. But in the book of Acts, this is where Paul landed. And in the book of Acts, chapter 28, verse 13 says, when he landed in Pozzuoli, he found Christian brothers living there and stayed with him a week. The Roman guards allowed him to stay there for a week. And it was from there on foot that he made his way to Rome, and which is eventually where he's going to die. But I actually have been to the place of Pozzuoli. And another little interesting side note to this, completely unrelated, is that the lovely Sophia Loren, the actress, is actually from Pozzuoli.
Hey, tying it into modern culture, I like it.
It's got it. And then you have yeah. So
okay.
The point is, the point I'm interested in all these cities is that this book, the book of Acts, this is not something that just Luke made up out of thin air. These are cities, and not just that they're mentioned, but specifics about these cities and their rulers and where they are geographically, and the prevailing winds, and how to get there. Some of these sea routes that Luke records. But you were going to say something, Sarah?
Well, I'm like, the time is going so fast. And so we've talked about the fact that he's going to all these cities. What is he doing? Right. And I think it's different for different cities, because sometimes he's appealing to a very like pagan Greek philosophy, and sometimes he's just preaching what happened to him. Like, what's the point of him going to these places? What's he doing?
It's a great question. The gospel. He's preaching the gospel. He goes to the synagogues first. He makes this case again and again. He goes first to the Jews and then the Gentiles. And in fact, Luke says throughout the book, as was his tradition, he would go to the synagogues. Why the synagogues? Because Christ was the Messiah. He was the promised Jewish Messiah. So he had a heart and a burden. In fact, he says, I wish I were cut off for the sake of my brethren. And he would go and preach that Christ was the Messiah. And interestingly, the apologetic, or the defense that he would use in the synagogues, was he would appeal to the Torah. He would appeal to the Old Testament. He would show that from the scriptures, he would reason with the Jews that Christ was the Messiah. And of course, they would eventually reject him. Some of them believe, a few of them believe, but they would reject him. Then he would go to the Gentiles. And along the way, he would stay with fellow believers. He would take odd jobs like being a tent maker. And along the way, he would plant churches and encourage the Christians there that were in these communities. I think it's interesting that even by the time of Paul, there were already believers in these places. Like, that's how far it spread, even that far, which goes back to something we were saying earlier, and that is the supernatural element of the early church, that it wasn't just the Roman roads were to help spread the gospel, that the Holy Spirit was at work. and that he was spreading this good news, the good news of the gospel, that Christ is the Son of God, that he died on the cross and rose again on the third day. It was spread far and wide, and Paul, I think, was there to sort of shore things up, to tighten the screws, to encourage the church there, and then, of course, to further the gospel. That's what he was doing. And of course, along the way, when he would do this, as would be expected, he was causing some trouble, and people were being upset with him. One case is in the book of in chapter 19, when he goes to Ephesus. There was a riot because of the gospel. He was upsetting the silver tradesmen there, the people who were making little idols of this Temple of Artemis at Ephesus.
That Artemis gets in the way so many times. Keep going.
And what I found interesting about Artemis is that Artemis was the Greek god of the hunt, the goddess of the hunt, and her symbols were the bow and the arrow and the quiver and hunting. She was a very important god in the Greek pantheon. Her temple in Ephesus was one of the wonders of the ancient world. In fact, it was written about by many ancient writers. And so it was sort of like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It would be like, I'm just spitballing here, but like St. Louis, going to the arch, of St. Louis. It would be like somebody going to St. Louis and taking a sledgehammer to the base of that arch. The people will be upset, like, this is our symbol. So when Paul's preaching about Christ and about God not living in a temple built by hands, and then people go, you know what? Yeah, you're right, Paul. Then the people who were making these little idols, these little statues of the Temple of Artemis, hey, you're attacking our very identity as a people in the city. And what's interesting about the time, and people look up like Artemis and they see this like Greek statue of this sort of godlike female figure or whatever. Well, that wasn't the Artemis of the first century or in Paul's day. In Turkey and Asia Minor, it had taken on a more local flavor. It had to do with fertility, and there's actually statues that have been excavated by archaeologists in the area in Sardis and other areas in Asia Minor that show Artemis, also called the Lady of Ephesus. And it looks like, and if people can see this, if they just Google Artemis, they may see a statue. And it looks like she's got like, and I'm not trying to be like crass here, but it looks like
it's like eggs and
it looks like
it
looks like 80 breasts on her chest, but it's actually not breast, it's actually eggs, and it has to do with fertility. And some people think that it's actually some scholars that I've read think that it was actually not even attached, that it was the statue itself was just sort of just a regular statue. This would have been like a garland that was hung around the statue in the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. So what's interesting about it is that it was eventually destroyed by the time of Justin in the 5th century AD. So we read about this, and again, it's just sort of a throwaway detail, but it's all the history actually backs it up.
It's interesting because, and that's just one example of partly why Artemis in this fertility, why that was woven into what Paul had to address in later letters, which we talk about, is because it gets at this kind of Gnostic idea, which was sort of weaving in, sadly, to Christianity, because both ideas were on the scene, and people were like, well, we'll have a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. And so there was this idea that Artemis represented fertility and knowledge and women and the power of women. And then that went back to Eve, and how Eve was like really the first most powerful woman because she had the knowledge, right? The snake said, or the serpent said, you can know the things of God and the knowledge of good and evil. And so there was all of this like sort of fertility and woman worship, which was sort of mixed in. And then Paul has to go back later and be like, y'all stop. Women are great, but Eve was deceived first. And we'll talk about that when we do another podcast. But, and as he's talking and as he's going in and out of jail, he's also writing letters, which are where we get the epistles later in the Bible, like Galatians and Ephesians and Corinthians and all that kind of stuff. And he's addressing some of the stuff that he has found along his journeys.
That's right. In the book of Philippians itself.
Oh.
No,
what were you going to say?
Were you going to say something, Evan? Oh, I thought you were going to say something, Evan.
Well, I was just going to ask a simple question for the simpleton, the simpletons like me, which is a critic. Critics are always trying to sort of say, well, the New Testament's some conspiratorial book, or it's not true, or it's elaborate, or, it's exaggerated, things like that. Do you find in the letters of Paul, and the Acts, that there is overlap, or are people able to say, aha, no, see, Luke must be wrong about the timing of this, the location of this, because in Paul's letters, it says that. I mean, are there critiques like that of the letters of Paul and Acts, where they can say, look, you can't claim infallibility or inerrancy or something like that because there are lots of inconsistencies here?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there are a lot of critical scholars, New Testament scholars, that would call into question the reliability of Acts, and really they attack it in the dating is where they attack it, not necessarily in the history, because there have been people that have been converted to Christianity through the historical reliability of Acts, and William Ramsay was one of these. He was back in the 19th century. There was a British Roman Greco-Roman archaeologist who began to look at the evidence, historical evidence of the book of Acts throughout Asia Minor, and was just blown away at the reliability of it. In fact, he wrote several books on this called Cities of the Apostle Paul, and was just remarkable. And then I mentioned another one earlier, Colin Heemer, who passed away sadly many years ago, but he was sort of carrying on in the footsteps of William Ramsay, and his book is called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And Heemer records 84 historically confirmed geographical references in the Book of Acts. So again, I'm sure that there are even scholars who do try to, be skeptical about it. But it's hard because the archaeology is so reliable, and it's just, but some of the things that have been discovered were not like set out by people to prove the Book of Acts. For instance, I'll give you an example. There's an inscription in the British Museum called the Politarch inscription that mentions a specific, a particular authority. Well, I'm trying to think of the word here. The government official, his role, the exact word for his role. It's politarchunon in the Greek. It's in Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 10, that mentions the authorities of the cities as politarchs. So this indicates that Luke, or whoever wrote the book of Acts, was familiar with that office in ancient Greece. And this archaeological discovery actually shows that that is the case. And another inscription that was discovered, a Latin inscription that's actually in Turkey, it was actually discovered in Syrian Antioch. It mentions the name of Sergius Paulus, who was very likely the same exact Roman official that was converted under the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 13. And then one more inscription that I'll mention was found in Greece, in Delphi, and it's the Gallio inscription. And this is found in the Delphi Archaeological Museum in Greece. And it is in fact, it's the only extra biblical reference to the existence of a particular man by the name of Gallio. And this also dates Paul's travels to specifically July through August of AD 51. So this is mentioned in Acts chapter 18. So earlier we were talking about the dating of the book of Acts itself. So circumstantial evidence, archaeological evidence, internal evidence in the text itself indicate that the book of Acts was written early, before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And then, of course, all the things we read about in the book of Acts, the focus itself is the gospel and the spread of the gospel and the works of the apostles, and how the early Christian message spread throughout the Roman world.
Okay, so I have to actually end soon, which I can't believe there's so much in that. So first of all, if you're listening, go read Acts. It's fun. I mean, it's a fun book to read. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that happens in it. But I thought it might be fun to give you just a couple quick rapid fire questions. Can you handle it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So don't give us a treatise. We're well, just what do you think? First, do you think that Philip teleported? Because there's a spot where Philip is talking to the eunuch, and then he baptizes him, and then it says the Spirit of the Lord carried him away, and he found himself at Azotus. Do you think that he just plop, picked him up from one place and took him back to another? Or do you think that's some sort of language used to say something else?
I tend to think it's probably a language thing.
Oh, that's not nearly as exciting as what I was hoping you were going to say. You don't think he teleported?
He could have. He could have. I'm not ruling it out. I'm just saying I'd have to look at it in more detail.
Okay. Second question is in Corinthians, but it's about Paul. So Paul talks about having a thorn in the flesh from Satan to torment him, and he asked the Lord to take it away. Any thoughts on what his thorn in the flesh was? I mean, a lot of people think different things, so there's no wrong answer here.
I have no idea. Yeah, I know that, of course, Luke was a physician, so it could have been a chronic illness that he dealt with, a pain. It could have been a wound from one of his beatings or something like that, but I don't know.
Yeah, but do you think it was something physical, at least, not
I think so. Yeah, I think it was physical.
Yeah. Okay. Neat. And then lastly, do you think that Peter was the first pope? I mean, that's obviously, I'm kind of joking, but Peter was it's loaded, but Peter was such an instrumental part of the beginning of the church. And then Jesus had said to him, I'm going to build Peter on this rock. And of course, the word Peter means rock. It was kind of a nickname that Jesus gave Simon. He's like, I'm going to build my church. And then you see him doing that. And Catholics, many would say he was the first pope. Where does that come from? Why do we not think that?
The reason I don't think that's the case. Now, Catholics do believe that he was the first pope. The reason why I don't is because of I think that text has been misunderstood by Catholics. I think it's not exegeted correctly. I think that what Jesus is saying, I will build my church on, wasn't Peter. It was Peter's confession that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's where the Greek.
For those just listening, Evan's like nodding and pointing and amening, basically, for a Lutheran.
The grammar has to match. You can't just eisegete the text to say the building of the church wasn't on. It was a play of words for sure, because Peter means rock, but it was on, because he asked him, who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood is not inherited, but my Father, and on this rock I will build my church. The rock.
Y'all, that's not even in front of him. He's just quoting it from memory. That's
just
why we
the rock of his confession. Just the confession that Christ is.
That's cool. I never really thought about it that way.
And in Matthew 18, all the apostles get the office of the keys, not just Peter. And and in Acts 15, tying it back to Acts, the council at Jerusalem, it's James who presides. That's right. So I think that Peter's not even the most authoritative apostle in the Bible. So and
he's so likable.
And there were multiple elders, people have argued, in Rome, and so
absolutely.
Okay. Well, as we close out, do you have like a favorite passage or story from Acts that you're like, if people are just going to go read one thing, read that? Wow. It'd be like Pentecost is pretty cool. I love, by the way, at Pentecost, so they all start speaking known languages, but not their own languages, right? And so all the people that are listening are speaking all these languages from around the known area, and they're hearing their own language and they're mystified, and people are saying they're drunk. And I love the response. You could never say this in 2022. Yeah. They're like, drunk? It's only 9 a.m. Like, y'all, there's plenty of people I know that are drunk at 9 a.m., but apparently not in the early church. Anyway. So
no, I think Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin in chapter 7. That's probably one of my favorites, because
it's really good.
It's so good, because here you have a first century believer pulling out the Old Testament connections with Christ. That's just pretty awesome stuff. And he says a lot of great stuff in there about the patriarchs, about how God delivered Moses. You
like it because it talks about Moses, and you love the Exodus. That makes sense. That ties it all together.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite spot in Acts, like a favorite story? Oh, sorry. I didn't tell him ahead of time.
The conversion of St. Paul. How about that?
There's another one too,
which is arguably not a conversion.
Yeah.
But like a fulfillment. Yeah.
Correct.
Neat.
But
there's another one too, where Paul, they're shipwrecked and they get on the beach, and there's a snake that attaches itself to Paul and just shakes it off,
Yeah.
Now, Sarah, what was that?
You know why Ted likes that? Because that also harkens back to the Exodus story.
He was like an action hero.
We should have action heroes made of St. Paul.
We should. I'm sure someone has done that.
He was so, when you look at Paul, honestly, this sounds really goofy, but he is honestly one of my favorite people in the New Testament. So humble, but yet so brilliant. I mean, absolutely brilliant, but humble, and had a passion for God. Like, if any of us could do half of what Paul did, I mean, can you imagine what the world would look like? Just his motivation and his selflessness is just amazing.
Yeah. Well, again, if you're listening, go read Acts, and I think that you'll be better for it, and it's exciting and fun. But Ted, if people want to ask you questions or pick on something that you said today, where can people find you?
Sure. They can email me at ted@epicarchaeology.org, ted@epicarchaeology.org.
When in doubt, add an A. If you're like, is there a vowel here? There is. Yeah. There's so many vowels in archaeology.
We also have a Facebook page as well, Epic Archaeology on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram and also YouTube. We have a new podcast coming out pretty soon with my colleague Doug Petrovich, and
he's a Houstonian.
He is. He has a new book out on the Israelites in Egypt, and we're going to be interviewing him. It'll be a 2-part, so check that out.
Cool. And of course, anything that you need to know about life, the universe, and everything in it can be found at HoustonTOT.com. Well, at least details about Theology on Tap can be found there. And what more do you need to know? But thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you listening, until we hear from you or see you next, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.